Global Conservation Corps presents the Rhino Man podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of Rhino Man the movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of our documentary film. In this episode, I'm talking with Julian Rademeyer. Julian is the director for East and Southern Africa for the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Prior to joining the organization, he was a project leader at Geographic, the International Wildlife Trade Monitoring Network. He is a former investigative journalist, and his best-selling book, Killing for Profit, Exposing the Illegal Rhino Horn Trade, was shortlisted for the Alan Paton Award. His work on illegal wildlife trade and organized crime has been featured on Al Jazeera, BBC, CNN, Sky News, and in The Guardian, New York Times, Economist, National Geographic, and many more. In this conversation, we talk about Julian's current work for the Global Initiative. We dig into his youth and path to becoming an investigative journalist. We dive into his obsession with organized crime and how he ended up focusing on the rhino poaching crisis. We go into his process and the journey of writing his book, and he gives an eloquent summary of his recent report, Landscape of Fear: Crime, Corruption, and Murder in Greater Kruger. Julian is full of stories, passion, and deeply researched information. It was an honor to spend a little time scratching the surface of his knowledge. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Julian Rademeyer. All right, Julian, welcome to the Rhino Man podcast. It's a real honor to have you on here.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I feel like your name has come up so many times in conversations over the years as I've been working on this project, and I've probably read quite a few of your articles before. I just kept seeing your name over and over again, so it just feels like you're such a legend in the space, and you've done so much work and research. I'm really excited to dive into a bit about your book, Killing for Profit, and especially the new report you did for Enact as we get going. But maybe to start, could you give us, what do you tell someone if you're at a party? Like, what do you do right now? And what's your role in some of the organizations you're working? And yeah, what's your overall day-to-day look like?
I did joke with some prosecutors I was talking with the other day that I don't get invited to parties anymore because I talk about organized crime and it's a bit of a downer. But yeah, these days I say silly things like I work on organized crime or I work on kidnappings and assassinations, which itself sounds a bit scary. But basically, I work for an organization called the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and I head up our work in East and Southern Africa. And that covers an array of organized crime subjects, work around organized crime, policy work, research work, and then looking at various illicit markets. So from the illegal wildlife trade, which is my sort of post-journalistic area of focus and an abiding passion for many years now, to the growing numbers of assassinations in South Africa in particular, the illegal gold trade in many neighboring countries in Southern Africa and East Africa, the heroin trade and drugs trades, some of that linking Africa to countries like Afghanistan and Iran and the Americas. So it's a wide range of areas that we focus on.
And what was the Global Initiative originally founded for? Do you know much of the history or how it came about?
So the Global Initiative was set up actually 10 years ago this year, formally founded. I actually went to one of the founding meetings back then when it was formally launched at the United Nations in New York. And essentially the underlying core of this is that there was the people who founded it, some of whom had worked for the United Nations or worked for the UN Organized Crime Division, others who were in fields of law enforcement and academia, felt that we needed something to change. We needed a new approach. We needed to look at organized crime in different ways. And we needed to understand organized crime better. In many cases, there were sort of reactive government approaches, policy approaches, which were ill-informed or could not be properly informed by the available statistics. So the idea was to try and create something back then, they called it a network to counter networks, bring together expertise from around the globe, link people together across civil society, law enforcement, bring new research tools, new innovative approaches to gathering data on, for instance, like pricing and drug markets. I would argue we probably have some of the most accurate drug pricing data in East and Southern Africa as a result of those sort of methods. And then work with civil society and governments to try and come up with new approaches.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've realized in the last probably since 6 months or so, since I've been working on this podcast and interviewing folks, connecting with organizations like United for Wildlife and some of their partners, that especially with rhino poaching for a long time, I think that part of it seemed to be left out. And there's been a lot of efforts to bring people together and look at this more as transnational organized crime as a way to really, figure out how to stop it, because just catching a poacher or a kingpin doesn't really seem to do the job on its own.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long, difficult battle. 10 years ago, it was seen as an environmental issue. I think to some degree today, it's still seen as an environmental issue, where you have, for instance, the Department of Environmental Affairs in South Africa playing very much a lead role in trying to coordinate activities related to this. I think the police are playing more and more of a role there. And I think steadily there has been a growing sort of realization of the transnational links. That's what I try to set out looking at when I worked on the book back in 2010, 2011, to look at this as an organized crime issue, because much of the reporting at the time was quite standardized. Rhino had been poached somewhere, quick interview with a farmer, quick interview with South African National Parks officials or parks officials in Zimbabwe or environmental people. But nothing really about where the horn was going or what was the demand for this. Why were people prepared to kill and die for a commodity like this? And I tapped into other work that I've been doing on organized crime, which has pretty much led to me working on organized crime now for nearly a decade, more than a decade.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to get into the book some, but what if we kind of take it back to the beginning? I'd love to know where you grew up, what kind of inspired you maybe early on to go into journalism or to focus on organized crime, and we can kind of work our way to the conservation side and rhino poaching. But yeah, where did this all start?
Yeah, I kind of blame my parents a bit for this, giving me too many detective novels and Sherlock Holmes and stuff to read when I was a kid, which gave me a sort of abiding interest in organized crime and crime more generally. But I grew up in Pretoria. My dad was a teacher, my mom as well. They were both very artistic. He spoke multiple languages, many of them dead languages that no one speaks anymore. He could read and write hieroglyphics, ancient Greek, he could read and write Quranic Arabic, which is always fun to hear him speak to people who speak ordinary Arabic. And he told stories, and he was very good at telling stories. We didn't have a television, so the sort of evening thing was music, and he'd pull out slides from various travels that he'd done, or it was National Geographics and that kind of thing. And I grew up in this sort of storytelling household. And I think from when I was quite young in high school, from my early teens, I wanted to be a journalist. It was a critical moment in South Africa where the country was moving from apartheid into a new democracy. There was a lot going on. There was a low-level civil war, for want of a better description, going on in many communities in South Africa, particularly rural provinces like KwaZulu-Natal, parts of Johannesburg, and on the East Rand of Johannesburg, enormous levels of violence, political leaders being released. It was an incredibly turbulent time where anything could happen. And you felt as if you were living through history. I think in many ways I felt then as if I was living through history, and there's been no sort of comparable moment, certainly in South Africa. I mean, there have been other things that have happened as historical sort of moments where you remember where you were, like 9/11. But this was something that consumed me. So straight out of high school, I tried to get a couple of jobs in newspapers, didn't quite pan out. Eventually knocked on the door of a reporter whose work I admired, who had an office behind a bar in a sports club in Pretoria. And I persuaded him to give me a job. I think he paid me $100 a month to pack shelves, and then occasionally take me out with him when he reported on stories. And through that, I got a freelance gig with a couple of people, ended up writing some stuff for Reuters news agency, some of that about the trial of former members of apartheid-era police death squads in South Africa, so the trial of Eugene de Kock, who was the commander of that unit, and then the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which exposed many of the horrors of the apartheid years and the abuses that have been committed. And moved around from there, worked in many parts of the country, worked for a variety of publications here and internationally.
Yeah, quite a journey for sure. And when did you make that connection of your love of, kind of being a detective and the journalism side? I mean, was that pretty early on? Then I guess the more investigative part of it and the research.
I always liked digging around. I loved research. I was quite happy to go and sit in a library and pour through books and dig up stuff or go and speak to people. I mean, in high school, myself and a couple of my friends there, we set up a current affairs little newsletter, which we brought up with the help of a very long-suffering English teacher who's now a publisher. And I think he had the foresight to see that this was something we really cared about. We had the ability to write sort of real news about real things that were happening in South Africa. Then it sort of grew from there. I started off like many reporters in the sort of mid-90s, around that time, late 80s, mid-90s, covering courts. That's where you learned accuracy. If you got it wrong, chances of being sued were pretty high. Chance of being fired by your boss was pretty high. And then you moved on to crime reporting, politics, and various other things, and then finally into investigation. So there was a sort of career path that was sketched out. And I spent many years covering courts and covering crime, and then moved on to other things and some investigations.
And was there ever anything that would have led you into the conservation world? I think I read in the introduction of your book this attack on a farmer that kind of sparked that journey into this world. But did you have any background? Did you make any visits to protected areas or Kruger National Park when you were young? I don't know if there was much of a connection to the wildlife side for you at all growing up.
I mean, not in that sense. We didn't actually, weirdly enough, we didn't go to Kruger much when I was a kid. But my mother was a very keen animal lover. We had animals around the house. She would rescue injured birds, we'd raise them, rehabilitate them, that kind of thing. But I had more of an affinity for sort of the chaos of politics and, what was going on in the country. And I wasn't a particularly outdoorsy kind of person then. Now I love hiking and going out into the bush and so on. Back then, not so much. I wanted to be in the kind of at the forefront of what was going on in the country. So it was only many, many years later where I kind of hit saturation point writing about corruption stories. And there were just so many, and there still are so many. And I'm not diminishing their importance at all. But I was trying to find something just a bit different. And I came across a story of a South African game farmer who had been detained in Zimbabwe, apparently had been smuggling weapons from South Africa across the border into Zimbabwe and then supplying them to poaching gangs there. Gangs that were poaching zebras at the time, and they were called the zebra gangs. And that had then morphed into poaching of rhinos. And Zimbabwe at that stage, South Africa was having some poaching. I wasn't really aware of it, and the numbers to me didn't seem that high because I just didn't really understand the issue. But Zimbabwe was getting particularly hammered 2006, 2007, 2008, before critical mass sort of hit South Africa. And here you had this Afrikaans South African farmer or hunter who seemed to be running with syndicates in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe at the time was in turmoil. There were land seizures, farms that were being taken over. People were fleeing the country in droves. And there were a lot of quite unscrupulous South African hunters and others who took advantage of that chaos to hunt illegally in national parks, to get involved in sort of poaching networks like this. The rifle had been seized there. I managed to get the serial numbers, find out where that weapon came from. And to my astonishment, that weapon traced back to a farm attack, an attack on an elderly farmer, his wife, on a farm not far from where this farmer hunter lived. And they'd been terrorized for several hours. Various weapons had been stolen. And one of the rifles that turned up in Zimbabwe was one of theirs. Here it was in the hands of another Afrikaner who was virtually a neighbor. And in fact, when they fled the farm, basically became a neighbor, and they lived a couple of blocks away from him. So that story fascinated me. There's trade in weapons across the border, the skullduggery that was involved, and the sort of intrigue. And I wanted to then sort of try and understand better who were the poaching gang, where was the rhino horn going? And, particularly at that point, very much also focus on Zimbabwe and what was going on in Zimbabwe, in the Southern Conservancies, the Low-Fault Rhino Trust in Zimbabwe, the Southern Conservancy, the Booby Valley Conservancy, for instance. The poaching was going on was extraordinary. You had gangs of people, some of them ex-soldiers armed with automatic weapons coming in there at night. People I know who worked there risking their lives to try and save these animals. Extraordinary people. People like Natasha Anderson, Raoul de Toy and others. And Blondie Leatham as well. People who were really on the forefront. And these anti-poaching teams that were working on the ground with bolt-action Lee Enfield rifles at the time, facing up to these kinds of heavily armed gangs.
So these early days for you, as you were kind of diving into this newer topic, what's that process like for you? I think I also read that at some point you decided to kind of quit your job to write this book and kind of go all in on it. And I'm just curious, what was that process like for you? How do you decide what to dig into? You've gotten to know all these different people you're tracking. You're doing stuff that's could be similar to police work in some respects, tracking serial numbers, things like that. What's this like in your mind as you're going through this?
Yeah, look, I think there were a lot of other people too investigating and digging into those serial numbers and so on. But, it's like, I think it was a story that was not being reported in that much depth back then. There were a couple of reporters who were doing some really good work, but it was something of an underreported story, and it didn't have the depth that you would hopefully see in a story. And I think, what I wanted to try and do was dig a little bit beneath the surface, get a better understanding of what motivated poachers, what motivated the consumers of rhino horn. At that stage, we still thought most, if not all, of the horn was going to China. Vietnam had publicly not really been identified as a destination country or a transit country. So there were a lot of mysteries. And then why the sudden influx in poaching? No one really got that. And there were a lot of people puzzling in the conservation world, puzzling over the same mysteries. So I think what I got an opportunity to do was write one story which led to other stories, and each one, this being South Africa, where almost anything is possible and the unimaginable is easily imagined. Each story just got wilder and wilder, from the kind of weapons smuggling in Zimbabwe to Thai networks recruiting prostitutes and strippers in bars in Johannesburg and getting them to pose as hunters in sham hunts, so they could then take the trophies out the country and then sell those illegally on the black market in Laos and Vietnam, to the historical stuff where you had South Africa during the border war smuggling ivory and rhino horn out the country. The first big US Fish and Wildlife case in South Africa where there was an extradition involved a South African army officer who had been smuggling ivory into the US to this larger-than-life character there. So there were all these characters, there were all these schemes and scams, people making fake rhino horn that they were using to dupe unsuspecting buyers. And I just it was like a rabbit hole. I have a bit of a habit of sort of getting sucked into something and then struggling to come up. And I think it was very much like that. And I saw pretty early on the possibility of doing some kind of book. I was initially approached to write a sort of quick hit 3-month book. I think my publishers by the end hated me because I probably missed every single deadline. I'm not known for being the speediest writer. But it was this incredible story that I found so unbelievable and just took me on a new journey and actually took me on a completely different focus in my work and in my life.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I haven't been able to read the whole book, but I have browsed it a bit. And as I was looking through it, I was like, I wish this was one of the first books on this topic I read, because your writing is really beautifully put down on paper, and it takes you to a place and the moment, and you just get this amazing sense of the people, along with all of the detail of the research along with it. So it's just super powerful writing, and you covered the topic from some interesting angles. We kind of mentioned that story with the gentleman in Angola opening those cases of all the illegal wildlife trade, or rhino horns and elephant tusks and furs and stuff like that. That kind of blew my mind.
And ammunition cases and so on.
Yeah. So, I think it's trying to... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it's got everything. It's got killers. It's got this shady, seedy underbelly of organized crime and the sex trade in Johannesburg and Pretoria, which is decidedly seedy. It's got, North Korean spies, corrupt government officials, dodgy diplomats, con men, people involved in cash and transit heists. It's really extraordinary what something like this has created. This little piece of, or these horns that have very little value of any kind, no medicinal value really at all, how something like that can become this prized commodity that people go to extraordinary lengths to get their hands on.
Yeah, I don't know why. Just suddenly in my mind, I was thinking, I don't know if you guys had it in South Africa, but there was the pet rock. It was kind of like one of these ideas where people just buy a rock, and it's not, I mean, it's almost the same thing. It's like, it's just doesn't have any value unless you make a story around it that creates that value. And it's just so sad that there's been that story that people will kill for. It's pretty wild. Trying to get into your mind as a journalist, as an author, what's that process like as you're kind of going after these stories and following leads? And I mean, there's got to be decisions and like, okay, I'm going to spend so much money to fly here to do this. Do I need to get funding? I'm just someone that's not a part of that world. I feel like as a documentary filmmaker, there's some similarities where you're trying to learn as you go and find the threads in the story. But with something like a book or an article like this, I feel like there's sometimes more depth. In a film, maybe you're just focused on a couple of characters, but you've got more time and more depth and ability to really dive into these things. So yeah, I'm just curious what your process is like as you're developing this.
I mean, I was so fortunate to have, a lot of people who gave me support from the beginning, including people who were working in conservation, doing incredible work. I'm just a storyteller. There are people on the front lines who are doing things that make the hair stand on the back of your neck in a daily effort to try and keep these animals alive. And it was those stories that also really grabbed me. But I think I had a boss at the time Jacques Poe, who's a well-known South African journalist. He was my editor in the investigations team that I worked on, and really sort of believed in this and connected me with his publisher, took a chance on this. And then I was lucky to get some funding as well from the Taka Caper Fund, which is a journalist fund over here, which allowed me to go beyond doing research just in South Africa and a little bit in Zimbabwe, but to dig a bit deeper in Laos and Vietnam. And I think a lot of it is I enjoy putting the pieces of the puzzle together, going out and interviewing people, getting those bits and pieces. The hard part is sitting on your backside and writing. And I'm not very good at that. As my boss would say, you need to sit in your butt and write. And that's basically what I had to do. And eventually, by the end, the cat was looking like she wanted to leave the house, and my better half as well. And I had this tiny little room with like bits of paper stuck all over the walls. I mean, it was really pretty grim. And I sort of emerged, and I was a bit moody. This paragraph doesn't work. This one doesn't work, etc. So that was a bit of a fraught process. But for me, the research is always the fun part. That's where you get out, you meet, you get to speak to some really incredible people. You get to hear their stories. You get to put together these pieces, and hopefully you do their stories and their work justice. Because very often there are a lot of people who are working quietly away, trying to do some of the investigators, some of the conservationists that I write about in the book, just quietly doing their thing without fanfare, without headlines or spotlights. They're the real heroes.
Is there anyone that stands out from that book in particular that, I don't know, if, changed the way you see the world, or you just had so much respect for? I'm sure there's so many. In the time I've been putting this film together, I think that's one of the things that I've realized. There's so many amazing people working to, especially in the conservation world, to protect the rhinos or just conservation in general. It attracts some really beautiful humans. And so I'm sure you've come across a lot in this work, but just curious if there's anyone that stands out.
Yeah, there are quite a few. There's some who I just can't mention their names, but they know who they are, who took quite extraordinary risks. There are others who trusted me when they didn't need to trust me. With some of the early investigations that they were working on and that I was looking into, included police or conservationist people in Zimbabwe, for instance. They didn't know who I was. I had no background in conservation or in journalism. And there were a lot of people who, gave me short shrift at the time as well, because they're sort of going, who's this whippersnapper? He hasn't been around. He doesn't know these things. And they're right. I knew very little to nothing about the conservation world. And it was a learning curve for me, which also made it so much interesting. So there were a lot of people who gave of their time extraordinarily generously and helped me out and took a chance on kind of a young reporter who seemed a little bit overly keen, so, which was good.
I mean, what was your attitude? You said you didn't know much then, but I feel like coming at it with a certain amount of curiosity or drive. If you're talking to someone else that's thinking about getting into this field, what would you tell them, like how to bring yourself to those situations?
I mean, I think the main thing is to recognize that, A, there's no such thing as a stupid question. Because I think a lot of young journalists and young researchers, and I've seen this with people I work with and so on, are too afraid to ask a question, and they'll sort of assume something because they don't want to look stupid. So that's the most vital one, is to ask the stupid questions. And quite frankly, if someone is going to treat you differently because they think you're asking a stupid question, they're not really that worth talking to anyway. And secondly, humility. There's no real space for someone to go charging in thinking that they have all the answers. I mean, you need humility. You need to be able to listen. And you need to do your homework. I find increasingly, and it's quite worrying in a way with young junior reporters, and I worry that in many newsrooms today, because they're so stretched, there's just simply not the time for news editors and more senior journalists to nurture and help grow journalistic talent, that you have reporters who contact you and basically they want everything on a platter. I mean, I've had people phoning up and say, "You brought out a report recently, talk to me about it. And what point about the report?" "Oh, no, we don't know much about the report." That kind of thing. And it's frustrating in a way. And I mean, I think I try and take time sometimes if someone shows that they're keen, because I was there myself once. I think journalistically, it's really important that people, particularly younger reporters, have some kind of guidance, that they're open to asking any question that they like, and that they feel they can knit together a sort of complex picture and tell a story.
Yeah, such good points. I mean, I think for myself, learning about this world, there's a lot of times where I probably had stupid questions. And I think something that helps too is you could just be like, "This is probably a stupid question, but
yeah,
could you help me
exactly.
figure this out?" And then, I feel like it disarms people a little bit. So yeah, don't be afraid to just admit it.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
And even, coming at it with humility, I think interviewing so many people in the conservation space, I think that's something that applies there as well, because, especially if someone coming from overseas that wants to help or get involved. I mean, it's, I guess, going into any new world, you need to go in there with ears open and more listening than saying and having too many assumptions. You might have some ideas, but be very flexible with them because you don't know yet. And there's so much nuance in everything. And I'm sure, I can't imagine the amount of depth and nuance that you were exposed to on this journey through just writing this book alone.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that you as a storyteller, no matter how long you sort of spend kind of embedded trying to do a story, you're dipping in and out. You're dipping in and out of people's lives. You can go somewhere else eventually, and you probably will. And they remain behind. And they're the people, and you know this as well as I do, who are on the front lines, who are taking the risks, who are under incredible pressures. And the best that you can do, hopefully, is to be a voice for them. And I'm quite old-fashioned about this. I don't actually like being the focus of sort of interviews or things like that. I mean, I sort of come from the background where journalists not the story. The journalist should fade into the background and let the people that they're talking to tell a story. I mean, even with the book, I was somewhat co-opted by the publishers into bringing a sort of personal element into it, which I found somewhat discomforting at the time. Which in my current role, luckily, I can sort of somewhat retreat in the back with the research, although now I'm doing more and more interviews about it. So, yeah, it's a trade-off. But I think the thing is you need to be aware of what your role is, and that you're simply there as a storyteller and to try and convey a message as best as you can and as accurately as you can.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so important. And I kind of agree, even on the documentary filmmaking side. It's been so important for me to make sure that the people's voices that we're following come through more than my perspective or, some kind of voiceover that's overlayered. And, but yeah, I think it's also kind of balancing that with, if you're telling some of your story, as long as it's enhancing the ability for their story to get out. I think there's a way to do it right. But I feel the reservations as well. It's always kind of strange to be talking about yourself when there's all these amazing humans doing this really difficult work that you're following. One more thing about the book before we move on to this report that you put out recently. Some of it was going to Vietnam and kind of researching what those markets are like on the demand side, and from the stories about the medicinal effects to the status symbol side of things. What was that like for you when you first dug into it and kind of were exposed to what people were going through who were on the buying end of it?
I think back then we knew very little, and there were people working in Vietnam who were doing some research and slowly building up information, but there was so little known. Even price data was all over the place. You had these extraordinary sums being mentioned for the price of rhino horn, many of them inaccurate. But it was trying to sort of get my head around something that I saw as someone who'd grown up in South Africa. Rhinos were these majestic creatures that you saw out there, and the cruelty that was involved in poaching stood out. And getting to Vietnam, where you see something that is simply just a product, there's a complete sort of disconnect in a way from the brutality of what's happening in Africa between that and the consumer markets. People who, in many cases, they had seen a rhino, they'd only ever seen it on television. I mean, certainly with some of the pseudo hunters that I interviewed, some of the young Vietnamese women and Thai women who were recruited to participate in these fraudulent hunts in South Africa. The only time they had ever seen a rhino was on TV, until the day they were taken to the carcass of a dead rhino and made to pose with a rifle and pretend that they had actually hunted the animal so that the trophy could be shipped to what was supposedly their address in Laos or Thailand or Vietnam, and then be cut up and sold off on the black market. And that's what sort of stood out, I think, most at that stage. But there was the other side too, which was the appalling desperation. I went to one of the wards, one of the cancer hospitals in Hanoi quite early on. And, this hospital had a traditional medicine section, which was encouraging patients to try rhino horn as a cure if things weren't working. And you had patients who were at death's door, many people who'd come from rural communities where there were barely any health facilities at all, certainly not the kind of care that they needed. And they were in the final stages. You had people crammed 3 to a bed, people queuing to get treatment. And I think that gave me an understanding to some degree of the desperation that would cause someone on the medicinal side to buy a rhino horn and try and use it. And coupled with the real tragedy, which is that most of those people in many cases were not buying what they thought they were buying. They were spending a fortune buying buffalo horn and other things. So there's a human side to it too on that aspect. And then you've got the other extreme, where you have, for instance, the vice chairman of Sacombank at the time, Sacombank being one of the biggest banks in Vietnam, who phoned up the police one day and said that thieves had broken into his house and stolen the horns off his rhinoceros. And the police turned up and they found literally an entire stuffed rhino in his living room, and the horns had been lopped off and the thieves had made off with them. The police at the time didn't really ask the banker too many hard questions about where he got this stuffed rhino from, and set off to try and find the thieves. As far as I know, they never did. But it turned out that he'd been given this thing as a gift by someone who was trying to curry favor with him, one of these sort of sham hunters, who'd brought the trophy, the entire rhino, back to Vietnam, and then given to him with a nice handwritten note wishing him well for the future and on his housewarming. And, that's an extraordinary scene. I mean, this is a senior figure in the financial sector who's receiving a gift like this. And what that says about sort of levels to how rhino horn can be used in corrupt ways, or how it can also be used to buy favor with officials, can be used as a sort of investment, as a valuable commodity. And today we see these various disparate markets for carvings, for bangles, bracelets, for whole horns, luxury goods markets, and how those have evolved and adapted over time, where, Western myths about the aphrodisiac properties of rhino horn suddenly become reality because the networks latch onto that, and you've got rice wine with rhino horn being sold as an aphrodisiac, or kids using it, in some cases as a hangover cure. So I think it gave me some interesting insights into that, and then just looking more broadly at the role of traditional Chinese medicine in Asia and the importance of traditional Chinese medicine in Asia.
Yeah, it's such a complicated situation and so many different things, different powers pulling on it. I mean, I can only imagine, if your grandmother is in the hospital dying of cancer and there's not even enough room or doctors to take care of her, and someone presents this to you, people are desperate, like you said, and will try anything. And it's so sad that people prey on other people like that, but so it is.
Yeah, and I mean, there's subtle elements too. Some cases when, as Vietnam and China, as economies have grown, people have had more disposable income. Their focus returns to their roots and returns to traditions and what those traditions mean for them. So there's elements there. I think it's very easy, and I think some of the initial demand reduction campaign attempts, for instance, in Vietnam were disastrous purely because they came with a sort of very Western view that said, you terrible people shouldn't be consuming rhino horn. Attempted in some ways to, sort of put down traditional beliefs rather than engaging with them. I think it's very easy, again, come back, we were talking earlier about, listening and not having preconceived ideas, but trying to understand things that we may, from our own backgrounds, find unfathomable.
Yeah, because I feel like demand reduction is so important, but if you don't understand those subtleties, then you're kind of just talking to a wall or offending people, or maybe even, inadvertently creating a new demand because people didn't even realize it was there until you told them. There's so many ways it could go. That's really interesting what you just said. I never really heard of the campaigns in that way, and I think it's difficult to have a 30-second PSA that has a conversation with people about their traditions and valuing them, but understanding that in the current world, these rhinos are being killed because of a misunderstanding or misuse or other factors.
Yeah, I think a number of those campaigns have become more nuanced as the years have gone on and as we've learnt more and more about the trade and understood the trade better. But it's taken a lot of time to get to that point.
Let's jump into the report you released recently, Landscape of Fear, Crime, Corruption, and Murder in Greater Kruger. What sparked this report for you, and what was its goal?
So what I wanted to do here, and I've been writing about this issue for a long time now, but I wanted to take a step back, and I think a lot of what I've written over the years has focused on some of the criminal elements and the networks involved, but fundamentally it's focused, or rhinos have been at the center of that research, or rhino horn's been at the center of that research. And I wanted to look at the Kruger National Park and how it fits into a broader landscape in South Africa and what's happening not only within the park, but what's happening around the park. The Kruger struggle, I think, in many ways mirrors South Africa's struggle against organized crime. And the Kruger is situated in a province that has a particularly complex history, one where corruption has been a key element for decades, preceding even the creation of that province as a sort of amalgam of what was then the Eastern Transvaal and a number of the apartheid-era homelands that were created to essentially separate blacks and whites. And corruption in those years, in the 1980s, was widespread. When the province was created in 1994, many of those elements both from homeland areas, but also from the Eastern Transvaal and corrupt government officials who worked there, were melded together. You had different police departments, for instance, the railway police, who were notoriously useless/corrupt, being brought into what was then the South Africa Police and became the South Africa Police Service. And so you had a number of these quite complex elements coming together. And Mpumalanga over the years, I think at the time, one of the first premiers of the province, Matthews Pauza, bemoaned the fact that corruption came out of every poor of society, and that there was a culture of corruption in the system that could simply not be rooted out. And that's just become steadily worse. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. The collapse of police crime intelligence capacity in South Africa, political meddling in the police, particularly during the Jacob Zuma years, to some degree still continuing, even though there are efforts to root it out. The loss of droves of skilled police officers who went into the private sector. The privatization, effectively, of policing functions. If you're wealthy enough in South Africa, you can sit behind wire walls with cameras and electric fences and private security. And coupled with that, the corruption that's gone unabated, both at high level but within rural areas. And a void, almost, a governance void that's been created in areas around the Kruger National Park, where you have entire communities where maybe the politicians pitch up before an election, but communities who, in many cases, are protesting. They use roads access the Kruger as a means to draw a line in the sand, block those roads and say, you need to listen to our demands. And some of those communities have been trying to get running water and electricity and, the most basic of services since 1994. For 30 years they've been trying. You've got high levels of poverty, close to 50%. And beyond that, people are eking out a living. And you've got an expanding population. I think 2019, around 2.9 million people living along the Kruger's boundary fence. It's probably closer to 4 million now. We'll see when the next census is done. And many of those people see very little benefit from conservation or very little benefit from Kruger. And when you have a governance void and when you have police who are too corrupt or too terrified or just not interested in communities, parallel government structures or parallel structures take shape. And these are run by, these take the form of illicit markets that fill the gap where the economy is stuttering or dying. These take the form of criminal actors who exploit people, who provide services to people. If you need medicines for your grandmother, who do you go to? You go to the local crime boss. He'll get you some medicines, but it comes potentially with a request down the line. You need a loan, he'll lend you money. And in that mix, you have rangers and other staff who work in Kruger. Many of them live there. Many of them do 26 days on in the park, 26 days off. While they're away, who's at home? Syndicate bosses or lower-level figures can come up to them and say, look, we know where your wife and kids are when you're not here. Anything can happen to them. You need to do this for us. And, in many cases, you'll find that the easiest option is just simply to go and do it, and then you get paid, and nothing happens to you, and you do it again, and you get paid, and it boosts a fairly paltry salary. There's obscene amounts of money which have gone into the so-called war on poaching. And yet at the same time, many rangers in the Kruger National Park have lived in appalling conditions, which haven't really improved. Tensions have grown over time within the park. I think you can argue strongly that there are systemic sort of structural issues in the park which harken back to the way it was structured in the 1980s and the apartheid years and the hierarchies that has created. And imagine yourself trapped in some kind of low-level conflict. Every day you're a threat in the park. You're under threat when you're outside the park. You are stuck in something that has been going on longer than, say, for instance, the Lebanese Civil War in the 1970s and 80s, or longer than the Angolan wars of independence in Angola and Mozambique. And there seems to be no end in sight. Eventually, morale crumbles, professionalism crumbles. And fortunately, I think that in many cases that wasn't addressed. What is good now is I think that with the new leadership in SANParks, particularly within the Kruger National Park, Kathy Dreyer, the head ranger, you have others there too, there's an awareness of these issues and an effort to try and address them and to try and find ways of rebuilding professionalism, rebuilding trust and motivation in not only the ranger corps but among staff, to try and sort of implement transparent and fair integrity testing, which could include things like polygraphs, but goes a lot deeper than that. And I think there needs to be transparency about the way that corruption is dealt with. It needs to be dealt with fairly, it needs to be dealt with swiftly, and it has to be dealt with consistently across the board, which has not always been the case in the past. And then aside from counseling for rangers, many of whom are burnt out, and particularly, people at the forefront who are jumping out of helicopters in hot pursuit of poachers, you need to create mechanisms and what shape that will take. And I think Kathy Dreyers mentioned this in an interview I did with her, is to somehow create safe spaces where rangers can talk about the challenges they face, where they can talk about the pressures they can face, where they can find ways of ideas of how they can better protect themselves or improve their lives, or that where they can feel that their concerns are being heard. And the need also for independent whistleblowing mechanisms. And I think, we've seen recently there were the arrest of 2 rangers in the Kruger National Park last year in the Stallsneck area of the park. Those arrests were the result of financial investigations conducted by the auditing firm KPMG together with the Hawks and also with involvement with the National Prosecuting Authority and Sandparks and Kruger. And that's led to the arrest of various others, including family members of the suspects. There's bank accounts that have been and sort of complex and not so complex movements of money have been unraveled, accounts open in the names of young children, that sort of thing, potentially amounting into millions of rands. And the impact of that was almost immediate. Poaching fell to nothing in that area of the park for 3 months. Not a single incursion, not a single incident. Poaching itself overall fell dramatically. So there are things that can be done. The problem, as is the problem in South Africa more broadly, is that there is so much damage that's been done. There is so little political will that's been demonstrated. There's so little impetus. People throw their hands in the air and say, we're becoming a mafia state. I mean, I hear this every day now. Virtually every second interview I do, I get asked, are we becoming a mafia state? And there's an urgency. We have a limited amount of time to turn things around, and it's going to require a commitment, a political commitment, a commitment. If you're taking the example of Kruger, from Kruger management, from Sandparks, and this is not a short-term commitment. You cannot undo years of damage. You cannot undo a situation where you, for instance, believe that 40%, possibly more of the people that you work with, your staff, the people that you interact with daily, are corrupt in some way, shape, or form, or are potentially, for various reasons, aiding networks and poaching groups. So this is going to be a long, very hard battle. I mean, I think there's some incredible people who are really putting an effort in, who are really trying to turn things around, and who are really thinking long and hard and coming up with innovative responses. But it's not going to be an easy challenge.
Yeah, that was a brilliant summary of a lot of the issues and some of the solutions. I mean, just thinking about on the corruption side within Kruger, if it's 40% plus, I can think of times, working jobs when, it's probably a small group and there's one bad apple and, it might not even be corruption at this level, but just someone with that negative energy and what that does to that workplace, let alone 40% and people that could be aiding in, killing rhinos and potentially even threatening other people within the organization. So it's just, it's such a complex situation, and corruption just feels like such a hard thing to crack. I mean, you kind of offered some of the solutions, and I've heard with the integrity testing too, it's more of, needing to look at it more holistically, where it's not just a test, but like you're saying, it's creating long-term career paths, more trust between people within the organization. I think that's a huge thing is trust, which has probably been lacking since before apartheid and still between people. And if that trust isn't there, it's so hard to move forward. And for rangers that are being threatened too, in a lot of cases, if they don't trust their management, then what are they supposed to do when someone's saying, hey, we're going to come to your house and kill you or your family, or, if you don't play along with us, you're in big trouble. So yeah, a lot of that needs to be addressed. I mean, specifically around that issue, what are your thoughts? Because I feel like, and maybe this is, I don't know, maybe another question is, what are people not looking at that you feel like needs addressed, or what are people more hesitant to talk about?
I mean, I think there's a lot being looked at within Kruger now. And I think importantly, it's not just looking at corruption, but it's looking at the drivers of corruption. Why do people become corrupt? Is it a case of people are corrupt because they're all bad apples, or is it because in some instances they have pressures, in some instances they have resentments that are built up for whatever reason, in some instances maybe they took money once to help a sick relative or something, and then it become an easy way to continue. In some cases, maybe they just sociopathically corrupt and up to their eyeballs in organized crime. So I think there's an array of different drivers that feed into that, and why people become corrupt and the sorts of pressures that are involved. And there's been a study that was done, an internal study with the assistance of WWF and USAID together with the Kruger, where staff management rangers were interviewed to try and understand some of these elements. So I think that's a very important starting point. I mean, it comes back to the whole thing of listening. How do you need to be able to work on this jointly. This is not something where you can't arrest your way out of this problem. You certainly, not in Kruger, not in South Africa. There is no way we will ever arrest our way out of the organized crime problem that we face today. So we need to come up with alternative things. We need to look at a range of possible options. And I think that's important. I think the other thing that is really important, and to some degree this is being addressed, but it's not being addressed at the right levels in some cases, is a look at how organized crime has grown, how it's entrenched itself, how it's metastasized in Mpumalanga more broadly. From the fact that Eskom, our power utility, has been corrupted to every single corner. There are syndicates who are stealing coal, replacing it with rocks. There are syndicates that are stealing copper cable by the ton, to the point where the entire country's economy has been corrupted. Obviously, there are also issues around maintenance in Eskom, but ultimately the issue around Eskom, the sole power utility in South Africa, is that it has become so corrupt, it's become to the point where it's even been divided up by criminal networks, that the entire country is suffering. And, in Mpumalanga more broadly, you have cash and transit heists. There's barely a week that goes by without yet another spectacular cash and transit heist. Military-style operations, 30 guys with assault weapons, explosives, fast cars, BMW X5s, ramming cash vehicles off the roads, killing drivers in some cases, blowing the doors off, making off with money. ATM machines being blown up, kidnappings, which have grown at a staggering rate in South Africa and in Mpumalanga. Illegal mining, another big issue in the sort of gold fields, the oldest gold fields in South Africa around Barberton and Mpumalanga. All of those different illicit economies coalesce and feed into each other. So then you end up with a situation where you've got someone like Chief Clyde Mnisi, who's someone I've written about recently. He became a traditional leader in October last year, replacing his uncle, if I recall correctly. There was a big coronation. He had a sort of plastic wrought iron gold chair that he sat on. He was decked out in leopard skin robes. There were senior officials there, including the treasurer of the African National Congress, the ruling party in the province, who attended this. But Clyde Mnisi was a crime boss. He was one of a triumvirate of crime bosses in Mpumalanga, along with people like Petros Sidney Mabuza, who was assassinated in 2021, who's involved in loan sharking and cash and transit heists, and had been involved in poaching or running poaching gangs in Kruger since the mid-2000s. We had someone like Big Joe in Nyalunga as his nickname, and he's a massive guy. Dodgy ex-cop who had been arrested several times since 2011. Once in 2011, when they found traces of rhino horn in the back of his vehicle that linked through DNA to two rhinos poached in Kruger, plus at the time around $300,000 in cash in his vehicle. 2012, he was arrested again in another police operation when he was set up in a sting to buy rhino horn. They raided his house. There they found, again, at the exchange rate at the time, around $500,000 in metal, boxes in the house. various weapons, rifles, a camera with photographs of a terrified young man being tortured, clearly, cans of beer in the background, a battery, and jumper cables, and he was clearly in pain. No one's ever found him. And then again in 2018, he was arrested in what was a police operation called Project Broadbill, which also targeted Big Joe Nyalunga and Clyde Mnisi, the chief. And then subsequently to that, again, he was arrested for a murder that had taken place. This is now Big Joe Nyalunga, for a murder that had taken place in 2010, when a neighbor of his, who also happened to work for the power utility, Eskom, had disappeared and been murdered. And the neighbor had been beaten to death and his body weighted down with a rock and tossed into a dam that supplied drinking water to one of the towns. And that's the sort of situation that you have these kinds of figures who become embedded in communities, have become respectable in a way, are looked up to. You can see videos of them being cheered outside court. There were demonstrations when they appeared in court. And then slowly, Shengu Petrus Sidney Mabuza gets assassinated in 2021. And then a week ago, Chief Clyde Mnisi gets assassinated. Classic organized crime hit. His car was tracked by 5 guys in a BMW X5. Somehow he had a puncture. There's some questions about why the vehicle he was in had a puncture. 4 of them get out armed with assault rifles, and they said something along the lines of, "You thought we wouldn't get up to you, now we've got you," and they pumped him full of bullets. This morning I heard that his wife had been assassinated 2 days after they buried him. Again, guys forced their way into Clyde Mnisi's home, shot his wife point-blank range twice in the head, shot 2 other people in the house and wounded them and took off. That's the sort of violence that surrounds this. We have extraordinarily high levels of violent crime in South Africa, but what makes them even more terrifying is how violent they are and how embedded these people are. Clyde Mnisi's funeral this past weekend, again, the same ANC treasurer. This is the ruling party, is present at the funeral. It says nothing about Mnisi's alleged links to organized crime. The president of Controlesa, the Congress for Traditional Leaders in South Africa, is also present. Again, doesn't say anything about it. The Democratic Alliance, the opposition party, even issues a statement, although admittedly they do mention the rhino poaching charges, but tendering their condolences to Clyde Mnisi's family and villagers and so on. And nowhere at a high level are you seeing people, aside from the police in statements about the murders, saying anything about this. It's extraordinary. There's no condemnation of the activities that he was involved in. So that's where we've got to in this country, where organized crime groups have become an alternative for many people. They replace a government that is simply not delivering. And they've gained sort of newfound respectability in some communities.
Well, we're getting close to the end, and I feel like don't want to leave it at such a dark place. There's so many challenges to be faced. But I guess on the flip side of that, I've spent probably close to a year in total in South Africa, and there's just so many beautiful people and amazing humans doing a lot of really amazing things to combat this and save wildlife, change the communities, make things better. I guess as a final question, what gives you hope in the midst of so much turmoil and corruption? And I mean, what you painted almost sounds like a scene out of Mad Max or something. What gives you hope, and why do you keep doing this work?
Yeah, some days it does feel like a scene out of Mad Max. We've got a sort of saying in South Africa that this country is a movie. And some days it feels like a tragedy, a farce, and a nightmare all wrapped into one. But I think what gives me hope, as you said now, the people. There are some truly extraordinary people who are going beyond the call to do everything that they can for this country. And we're blessed with remarkable people. Not so much in politics or in sort of major sort of political leadership roles in government, but outside of that, we have truly extraordinary people who are taking on pressures, taking on stresses that most people will crumble at. People in conservation, people who are working in national parks, people who are trying to find solutions. And I think that for me is what gives me hope. We can't sit back and expect government to solve this. Government's not going to solve it. Government hasn't solved it. Government makes it worse most of the time. The police make it worse most of the time. So it's kind of up to us as the citizens. It's up to us to become a more engaged as citizenry. And that's difficult in South Africa because this is a country that's deeply unequal, that is deeply divided. But it's something we need to strive for. I think that we're blessed as well. We have strong civil society organizations. I don't entirely buy this argument that we are becoming a mafia state. I think that, sure, there are areas of massive concern. The numbers of assassinations, the rise in violent organized crime, the nearly 70% rise in murder rates in the last decade. But I think also that we've shown in the past that we can overcome these sorts of things. We've shown that we are determined. And quite frankly, we don't really have much of a choice. Well, we do have a choice. We can throw our hands up in the air and say, it's all over. Let's just give up and we'll curl into a ball and die. Or we can actually stand up and be counted and make our voices felt and do even the smallest things to try and improve the country for ourselves and the people that live around us. And that's a really hard thing sometimes to do, but that's what we need to look at. This is about us. We need to pull our weight. People need to get involved. You need an active citizenry. You can't sit back and sit on a couch and complain all the time. And there are people out there every single day, people in the conservation world. You've met many of them. I've met many of them over the years. People in the Kruger National Park, people in the Hawks, the organized crime investigators, people in the South African Revenue Service, in the National Prosecuting Authority, in all these structures who get up every single day and they keep going and they're trying to make a difference. And that inspires me.
Well, thank you, Julian, for the work you're doing, for your voice, and for all the voices that you've been able to highlight and the good that you're able to bring to the people that are doing a lot of this work on the ground. It's been a pleasure getting to speak with you. I feel like we could probably spend another half a day digging into a lot of this stuff. But yeah, this has been really great.
No, thanks so much for having me on. It's a real privilege.
One last thing, where should people go to follow you if they want to learn more and find your book and see your work?
So the book's called Killing for Profit. And if you want to look at some of the work that we're doing at the Global Initiative, go to globalinitiative.net.
Perfect. All right, Julian, I'll let you go. Thank you so much again.
Take care. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to the Rhino Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Rhino Man the Movie. More details about Rhino Man, the social impact campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who've dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simone Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for Rhino Man the Movie. Learn more about his work at simonewilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the Rhino Man Podcast.